Our God, we ask you to guide our thoughts and our reflections, that they might give you glory and be the work of your King. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. I think the conference organizers, Bob Priest and company, invited me, and I need to confess this, because I probably made more mistakes in short-term mission than anybody in the room. So let me begin with that. Some stiff competition, perhaps. And as long as we can approach this very mine-filled area where there's strong feelings all around, in a bit of a spirit of humility, and be open to God's leading, so that wherever we are in this world of ours, that we might do more faithfully and effectively this work. That'll be the goal, at least for this hour. If you look at the literature, you'll see that short-term mission trips have received significant criticism, particularly in the last 10 years. Social science brings its data, its lenses to look at what's actually happening out there. We find significant criticism, both from missiologists and from social scientists. Criticism that often focuses on the inherent inefficiencies of short-term mission. The lack of cultural awareness, negative impacts on local Christian witness or social services. Maybe even the limited nature of that personal transformation. We heard that a bit this morning in Ruth's presentation. At the same time, some scholars have sought more broader impacts. Bob Priest talks about linking social capital that has happened. We looked at it in Peru and some other places. Robert Wotno looks at status bridging social capital, and Kirsten Priest looks at the globalization of empathy. Some different measures, some different lenses to look at this phenomenon. In a globalized world, often the causes of poverty and injustice are located not in that local community, but distant from that place. Perhaps decisions being taken in a boardroom in New York City or Miami, or in corporate meeting rooms, courtrooms, or congressional halls a world away. Many of us working with a project that the Presbyterian Church has begun in about 11 countries of the world, a program called Joining Hands Against Poverty. Many of us were quite cynical, not even critical. We were cynical about the short-term mission movement. If you understand short-term mission trips to be short-term mission, and I'll use that interchangeably this afternoon. In this globalized world, we were trying to get an understanding of this is a phenomenon, this is happening. There's millions of North Americans who are traveling to see this work. Call it Christian tourism, Christian voyeurism, call it what you will. They're here. Is there a way that we can link, connect, and is there a way that we can become more of the body of Christ in a globalized moment? That's what we'll look at today. I'd like to take you, if I may, to the city of La Oroya, Peru. It lies about 11,000 feet up in Peru's central Andes Mountains. It's home to about 35,000 people, including nearly 8,000 kids, aged 17 and below. Any view of the city is dominated by a large smokestack owned and operated by the Dough Run Peru company. It's a metal smelter. And so to get a gold ring like this, any silver that you have in your teeth, those kinds of things, you need a metal smelter. It's just part of the way that we live. It's what we've come to demand. Your laptops use lead. Your cell phones use lead. And so we need those things, and that work is done at metal smelters. This Dough Run Peru company is a subsidiary of a U.S. corporation called Orenco Corporation, based in New York City. Here's the problem. While the smelter provides more than 2,000 jobs and thus forms the mainstay of the local economy, each day the Dough Run smelter, and I'm thinking we could probably lower these lights. Is that true? Is that possible? You probably would rather see this than me. There we go. Thanks. That's great. Whichever. Down in front would be great. Yeah, that's fine. I can see. Each day, this smelter, owned by the Dough Run Company, releases more than 2 million pounds of toxic emissions into the atmosphere, into the city. sulfur dioxide, lead, cadmium, and arsenic, as well as other heavy metals. Consequently, the Blacksmith Institute has ranked La Jolla as among the 10 worst polluted places on the planet. According to a study conducted by the St. Louis University School of Public Health and the Centers for Disease Control, more than 97% of La Jolla's children under the age of 6 suffer from lead poisoning. Well, 97% of the kids in your town, if they had lead poisoning, you'd hear something. You'd hear screaming. You would hear city hall meetings, sit-ins, near riots. That's not the case in La Jolla. And the patterns of financial dependence, economic dependence on the company are a major factor in that. In thousands of cases, the lead levels are so high that the child would be hospitalized immediately if she were living in the United States. One environmental health scientist noted that lead levels as high as those experienced in La Jolla can reduce a child's intelligence by as much as 1 IQ point every year that the child lives in La Jolla. We'll do the math. Think of your own children and grandchildren. Because U.S. corporations are not required to meet EPA standards in the country of overseas operation, but are allowed to legally pollute at much higher levels in countries desperate for foreign investment and jobs, one journalist described Doran's strategy as offshoring pollution into La Jolla's homes and families. That's the context. And in that context, the Joining Hands Against Poverty Network of Peru, it's a group of 14 Peruvian Protestant churches, NGOs, community-based groups. We were organized by the Presbyterian Church USA in 2001 as creating a space, a platform where people concerned about poverty in their communities could come together and begin to reflect on its causes and say, is there something that we could perhaps make an impact on? We can back up a little bit and before we get to the test results. That's great. Perfect. Thanks, Ellen. We responded to a call in 2002 for help from Esther Nostrosa, who is a national women's leader in Peru's evangelical church and the director of a Joining Hands member organization called Filomena Tomaira Faxi, which works basically in maternal child health issues in La Jolla. They asked us to send a pastoral team, a group of folks, to sit with people in La Jolla, primarily mothers, fathers, and teachers, and to understand from their point of view what was going on in children's health. At the time of their trip, there was little scientific information available to La Jolla's parents. The only thing they had to go on were the headaches, learning disabilities, aggressiveness, and cognitive impairment that they had observed in their children. As one member of the pastoral team began to understand the magnitude of the contamination and its impact on children's health, he said, kind of a throwaway line, he looked at one of the other pastors and said, imagine if these were your kids. And Esther, without missing a beat, turned to him and with perfect biblical clarity said, but Pastor, these are your children. And there was silence in the room. Thus began a complex process that would weave together La Jolla's families and churches with short-term mission teams from the United States and 2 cities in Peru. We received short-term groups from both areas. Long-term mission workers and Peruvian U.S. environmental and human rights groups, some of whom were profoundly non-religious or anti-religious. We were linking social capital in a way that included political power, media contacts and savvy, theological reflection, and even prayer. And we did that together as a group. This led to the transformation of numerous people in this process that I'd like to detail with greater clarity. But let's look first at the results of that campaign. If we look, you'll see that there were really 2 objectives of the campaign, at least as far as our network. We were in support of a community-based organization called the Movement for Health of La Jolla. To do that, we, after long dialogue with them, lasted more than a year so that we could fully understand what it was they needed. They said, we really need you to provide us with scientific data. The company tells us one thing, but our experience is telling us something very different. Could you help us? And we said, we're mostly church groups, but this is something that we can do. With the Wing and a Prayer and $7,000, we thought we could purchase the technology needed to do an environmental health study. They're not that cheap, friends. The final cost was $435,000. But through a series of events fueled by the short-term mission movement in Peru, we were able to identify the needs that we had, ask partners in the States to send people with those professional backgrounds, expertise, and skills so that they might step in and come alongside us to accompany us. One of the results then was that short-term mission groups did a preliminary blood test for 100 kids. They published those results in Toxicology's the National Association of Toxicology for Canada and the U.S. both. That was published in July of 2004. It hit the charts. It hit the fan, however you want to say that. It made big news, and almost every toxicologist in North America knows about La Arroya now because of that one short-term mission person from Broad Street Presbyterian Church in Columbus, Ohio, whose testimony I'll read in just a bit, who thought she could bring nothing, and because of her gifts and skills that she had and her willingness to share them, I was able to give a major gift to the people of La Arroya. The Joining Hands Network was able to leverage St. Louis University School of Public Health and the CDC to provide this full range of testing, both environmental samples and biological samples, for free, $435,000 worth, because they wanted to study something that they'd never seen lead levels this high in the human population. The short-term mission groups provided logistical support and served as international monitors. A little later on, I'll show you some flyers that the company was putting out during this time because they didn't want us to carry out the tests. The second effort was the media campaign. Mothers and teachers said, would you please get our story out? And that's one thing that you can do because the media is controlled in the local area. It's a company town and we can't get our message out. We want people to know what's going on here and we want them to intervene for us. And so short-term group members provided media consulting. We leveraged media contacts. We knew nothing about the media. We knew nothing about journalism and had to learn everything. So we had to leverage for that. We had to connect with other folks who did have knowledge. And a remarkable number of Presbyterians we were able to connect with, media consultants, people who make their living doing this, and they gave us free advice, which was worth thousands of dollars. They also showed us how to provide that local hook. If you want to get a local journalist to report on your story, you have to show how it's related to your area. So every time a short-term mission group came to visit us in Peru, when they returned, we would teach them, give them the tools so they could make a splash in their own local paper. And the local paper would report on it because this was quite the story for them to carry. This health crisis eventually was reported in 500 U.S. newspapers. The New York Times ran a story on it 3 weeks ago. 8 Peruvian newspapers and magazines, CNN, CBS, and the list is up there. The resulting pressure resulted in Peruvian congressional hearings. 2 short-term mission workers came back to testify in Congress because they knew that's company's corporate behavior in another context because there was a smelter in their town that this company owned. The company stated that it was decreasing its contamination. That has recently been contested by a more recent report. But the Peruvian government has implemented enhanced environmental monitoring. So we are pleased that there are some positive signs, though the kids of La Arroya are definitely not out of the woods yet. The media campaign did raise the consciousness and granted legitimacy to a social mobilization in the Latin American context. In Peru, there's a strong suspicion. This is the Peru that's is living now after Shining Path Liberation Movement. So if you go to the streets and ask for justice in the streets, or if you're from the countryside and you ask for justice, people immediately think, oh, this must be one of those Shining Path kind of people. And so you need legitimacy. The Catholic Church, as a result of this campaign, the Catholic Church, the Council of Churches, the Protestant churches, etc., came alongside this movement and radically changed the playing field, granting their social power and legitimacy to this small movement of people. By giving this scientific evidence and access to international media, the network was able to create a space in which La Arroya Christians were able to leverage political power and spiritual power together with North Americans. I'd like to think then in terms of transformation, and you can scroll through these if you like, Ellen. This just shows some of the news media that picked up on the La Arroya story. This was after a hiatus. There was, for 4 years before this campaign began, the story had never been reported in a Peruvian newspaper or magazine. And then when it kicked, it started popping into all kinds of places. A limited notion of mission focuses exclusively on its impact on the receiving community. That would be a more traditional form of mission. David Bosch and others remind us of the mutuality of Missio Dei. as it transforms not only the host community and the missioner, but also the notion of mission, what mission is. How are the short-term missioners, or mission workers, or mission participants from both the U.S. and Peru, how are they changed by their experience of mission in La Oroya? A total of about 90 North Americans and 40 Peruvian Catholics and Protestants have traveled with the Joining Hands Network to La Oroya between 2003 and 2006. Youth from the U.S. and Peru worked with La Oroya youth in an ecumenical team. They painted murals, they went to schools, they talked about God's creation, the responsibility humanity has for caring for that creation. They didn't give political talks, they didn't say pro-company or anti-company, they just shared their own perspective on caring for God's creation. They created and broadcast radio talk shows, visited schools, and designed and produced street theater, all for the purpose of witnessing to God's intention in creation. A small team led by a pharmacist from Ohio brought that portable lead care instrument that started the ball rolling. We were able to get that St. Louis University large testing done to collect blood, urine, and environmental samples in 2005. All of these groups spent significant time listening, and most of the time that they spent was listening to the families of La Oroya to understand the situation from their perspective. So what was that impact on short-term mission workers? Among both the Peruvian and U.S. short-term mission workers, there was a deepened recognition of the tangible, globalized solidarity that we enjoy in the body of Christ. It's something that we all give at least lip service to. We believe it across the board theologically, and yet we so rarely live it out. And yet we were suddenly in a moment where we realized that if we do have the same Father, God the Father, then we're all related as brothers and sisters. These kids then are part of my responsibility. I would go home. I lived in Lima, about 4 hours from La Oroya. I'd ride the colectivo down the hill, down to Lima, down the 11,000 feet in 4 hours. Get back to my house and take 3 showers before I would go to my kid's room and kiss them goodnight, because I knew I was covered with lead, because I'd been in La Oroya, say, for 4 to 6 days. And I would take a shower, start to kiss them, and no, I'd go back and I'd take sometimes 3 showers because of the high level of contamination that you just carry with you. One of the pharmacists from Columbus, Ohio said this: "I was troubled by this La Oroya project. We were told there that there was lead poisoning going on, and we were to tell the story back here in the States, but there was no proof. So we did what we could to gather the evidence in a small way, and the rest, I guess, is history. We and the mothers found out together in the freezing room that we borrowed from the midwifery clinic, when the number popped up on the tiny screen on the handheld device, that each and every one of their children had enough lead in their blood to cause brain damage. In the U.S., as a matter of federal guidelines, each of these children would have been immediately admitted to the hospital. But in a globalized world, that wasn't happening. And so when people ask me why I go on short-term mission trips, says Patty, I try to tell them that it's my story. It's a story about the average pharmacist from the Midwest who was asked to go and learn about these people in a far-off place and tell their story. In doing so, I'm asked to step into a space that's not familiar to me and that I had no special interest in at first. I was able to see and live and learn that the most vulnerable among us are here and now, as surely as those at our local food pantry are among us here and now, and to learn and live the duty and the delight of working with and for them. David Bosch speaks of the 2 risks: the risk that they will be changed when we go in mission, and the second risk is that we will be changed. And that was a frequently cited experience among the short-term mission workers. 11 of these short-term mission workers of the 90 have decided to attend seminary as a result of their time in La Oroya. One of the short-term mission workers described it this way: "I had to travel to one of the most polluted places on earth at 14,000 feet to hear God whisper in my ear and ask me to follow him into ministry." Others of the short-term mission workers changed their career paths to study public health, law, and social work, were the major 3 areas that the young people had committed to study as a result of this experience. This is self-reporting, and we have not done the independent verification. We need to look 5 years in and see what people actually study and how those career changes, what path they take. I'd like us to think in closing about how mission itself is transformed. Again, following David Bosch's typology. The short-term mission work, joining hands in La Roya, impacted the short-term missioners' understanding of God's mission. Most of us have not considered the work of advocacy or accompaniment of the oppressed, or even the work of justice as particularly a focus of mission. Esther Nostroza said it well for many of us. We were accustomed to giving hungry people a fish in Christ's name, or even teaching them to fish, but we've never given thought to what Jesus would have done when the river which runs through their town is contaminated. We realized then that Jesus wanted us to do something more. That something more was what permeated our thoughts and our prayers and haunted us at times as we sought to be faithful in a situation of massive injustice. One of the first short-term mission groups was actually detained by the local police in 2002. Their passports were taken from them, and when they were later told that the police action had come as a result of the company pressure, which had grown wary of the increasing numbers of short-termers who were coming to the city, this outrage galvanized their opposition. They were bonded, as I've never seen a binational group bond before. Those folks, there were 7 in that first group, and all 7 of them are still in at least monthly contact by email with the people who went through that experience with them. The Friends of La Roya was started by one of those people, the Reverend Eleanor Stock. It's grown to a group. It's about 17 NGOs in the United States and Peru, and about 14 Catholic religious orders, Protestant denominations, and parachurch ministries, all working together to raise the level of awareness and to decrease the pollution levels. According to a preliminary questionnaire given to most of the short-term mission groups, most participants before traveling to La Roya had understood mission to be something that one does in a remote location. If you ask people what is mission about, frequently it involves something that's being done out there, sometimes with exotic adjectives attached to it, but generally it was just a remote location. This experience changed, folks. The aspect of our short-term mission project in La Roya that changed me the most, said one missioner, was being on the ground, seeing and experiencing firsthand the abuse and injustices that seem so far removed from my daily existence, except for my own culpability in them as a member of a consumer society from which they're generated in the first place. The images of the mountains that had been ravaged by pollution for generations, and the courage of the young people calling for a new future, I'll never forget. That's right. Let's flip back to the chart if we could. We can flip the lights on. Could you flip on maybe just one of them? That's great. Thanks. If we look at what were the strategies that were used to increase the short-term mission, this is one experience of short-term mission. It's a radical one. It's a wild and crazy one. And yet one of the learnings was situations like this are happening all over the place. If you were relating to folks in Mexico, in the 4 years after the free trade agreement was signed, NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, in the 4 years since that was signed, the average Mexican corn farmer lost 1/2 of his or her income. So how are we relating to these folks on our mission trips to Mexico, the #1 destination, if we're not somehow taking into account what this trade agreement signed by the elite, really, of both nations, what that does is impacting, how that is impacting our sisters and brothers in Christ in that place. We've got to take into account some of these contextual issues because they're that's what's screaming, is the silent scream in the room. Oftentimes we're sitting with partners and we're the only ones in the room with Social Security and travel insurance and a guaranteed income and all those things. That power differential is so present in our relations with partners. How can we cherish those and still treat sisters and brothers in Christ as such? That is a major struggle for many of us. What we saw, briefly, we felt that one of the most critical pieces for us was the strategic selection of short-term mission workers. We went to them, we said Joining Hands is a association, a gathering of 19 Presbyterian congregations in the U.S., mostly around Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri. But we went to them and said, this is what we're looking for, can you help us? And they would go through, they select, sometimes they go to other congregations, Lutheran, Methodist, Catholic, and find someone who had those skills to come and help. We needed media help. They'd go beat in the bushes to find folks who could help us to get the media coverage that we need. You know someone who can write the article. You know someone who can get this into the paper. And thus leveraging a greater impact. This notion of the localization of mission, that people began to see mission, our own experience of mission was transformed as we realized that it's not just out there. It's not because the people are different from us. It's here among us as well. The impact, my wife and I, 26 years ago, exchanged these, a wedding band. What we now know is that to produce just that much gold, somebody has to dig up 60 tons of God's earth and crush it and spray it with cyanide, separating the gold ore from the rock, and produce this in a town like La Oroya, or Penang, Malaysia, or Carachipampa, Bolivia, or other places, mostly outside the United States and Canada. This impact of our choices, the everyday choices that you and I make, what shirts we'll buy, fair trade or not, what coffee we'll buy, fair trade or not, suddenly those impacts begin to have a massive impact, because those aren't just people out there or the faceless millions, but it's Raul and Saul and Mariana and children just like yours and mine. This globalization of mission drew us tightly into a sense of mutuality. We all needed to work together in Christ's mission. And so Missio Dei, the mission of God in Peru, left the local boundaries of Peru and connected all of us into that global body that is the Church of Jesus Christ around the world. This was an effort that we worked in that was networked, and it required training. We didn't know how to network. That was not any of our natural mode. We knew something about social networking. We knew how to have friendships. We knew how to express friendship. We knew less about that crossing cultures. But it was a powerful moment that we learned that we needed to leverage support for the work that the community was involved in. The context of commitment to mutual long-term relationships was very important for the leadership to begin from the very start. When behaviors, discourse left the path of mutuality and respect for all, when folks, the natural racism, the natural classism, that is part of the cultural baggage that many people carry in the mission, when that blurted out in difficult moments, it was really important for the leadership together to have a commitment to address it. Not in a judgmental sense, but to help that sister or brother back onto the path of mutual respect and mutuality. This led to ongoing theological reflection and continues, we have an e-group, and it continues to nurture that conversation with the friends of La Oroya, many of whom are beyond the church. They're environmental groups, they're human rights groups here in this country and other countries, and this religious discourse is quite new to them. But they're fascinated by this group of Christians who are deeply committed, because of their faith, to standing with the children in La Oroya. The use of binational teams has been mentioned in another workshop this morning, looking for ways to embody that accompaniment, that mutuality that we felt was so very important. And so we generally always had Peruvians and North Americans working together on these teams, because the way we represent what we're doing to a group of people, if it was just gringos painting the mural, that says something very powerful to Peruvians. There's a sense of excludedness or exclusion that we did not want to express. And then I mentioned this mandatory follow-up. One of the congregations, one of these 19 congregations, Broad Street Church in Columbus, Ohio, they meet monthly still. Their first trip was in 2002. Every 2 years they do it, 2004, 6, 8. They continue to meet monthly. They call themselves the Peru Crew. 2,000 members in this church. It's a large, rather cold, they self-described cold Presbyterian church downtown Columbus, Ohio. But this has become a cell group in the context of a local congregation because it gives them a common focus, a common sense of how God's mission is enacted in the world. And has provided an intergenerational space where kids who are having a little trouble with mom and dad in their own house context, their own home, are able to allow that takes a village to raise a child situation where other adults who travel with them to Peru become surrogate parents 4 instances in that one congregation of kids, teenagers, with difficulties with parents going to live for a time between 1 month and 6 months with one of those surrogate parents who they've come to know and love and respect through the Peru crew. So somehow short-term mission has turned around a space, or has created a space in God's frozen chosen, the Presbyterian Church, to allow people to encounter each other in a profoundly Christian way. And that's something that we're thankful for. To close, I'd say that in today's rapidly globalizing world, the plight of Laoia's children and the children of Mexican corn farmers and kids in many countries around the world are forcing short-term mission workers to consider anew Dietrich Bonhoeffer's urgent question. Will the church merely gather up those whom the wheel has crushed, or will it prevent the wheel from crushing them? That's what I wanted to say. I welcome your questions, your comments. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned training and networking. How did you do that?
Yeah. What we did was we asked for the groups to tell us what they needed in training. A number of these groups, they're repeat groups. They come, we asked them to come no more than once every 2 years. We've asked them to invite our groups from Peru to travel so that it can be a two-way exchange. And the training has been developed. 3 of the churches had both educators and folks more experienced in missions and folks who work long-term. International folk who come and were living in St. Louis, and they worked together and put together a training module. We use that now. We share that more widely as another congregation as they want to join this group. We share with them those training materials.
Is that something we could get access to?
Sure. It's a 6-session training module. They do 6 Sunday evenings together before they travel, and then the discipline is that you're committing to a monthly gathering. They do that both in the 14 congregations in St. Louis, the Broad Street congregation in Columbus. So you make a commitment. Everybody wants to go on the trip because they know it's cooking, things are hopping there. But to do so, they put their expectations on you from the start. You want to go? Here's what you're going to have to do. Are you willing to do that? And then the congregation send them. They have their own commissioning services, as many do.
So should we email you or what?
That would be great. I'd be happy to share that. Yeah, if you want to email me, I can do that. It might be easiest if I try to put it on the web, because we've got it on a CD. Email me if you're interested, and I'm happy to share that with you in some passion. Yes.
This is an amazing and a brilliant case study, and very encouraging to hear. But there are elements about it that I think were very particular to this situation that I don't see in a lot of the short-term missions. So that as a case study, maybe it's something that we need to aspire to and we can learn from, so that we can work those things back into what we understand to be the average general short-term mission. And as I try and think about it, the 6 things that stand out for me. Number 1 was that it's a very strong cause that drove this, this short-term mission experience. It was something that galvanized people with a very, very strong cause, a justice cause that people rallied around. Number 2 was that there were clear outcomes or goals that could be seen. We need to stop this company, we need to do something, and it's not off in the horizon, it's not fuzzy, it's something that we know has probably a 2 to 10 year layout period, but we can do this thing. I think a third thing is that there was clear achievability. This thing can be done. It's not like alleviating poverty, which nobody knows how to do that, and so we stab at it, but this one you could see that, if we really galvanize the media, etc., it can be achieved. A fourth difference for me is that there was a clear social and skill networking. We need media people, so that it was easier to galvanize people around this because it was clear what skills were needed. And some of these you discovered as we went along, but they were clear. A fifth one would be that it was branded as the children of, this place. And it has higher emotional appeal. They are voiceless, they do not know how to defend themselves, and it was interesting in one of the sessions we had to see that the majority of short-term missioners going out are asking to go and work with orphans.
That's correct.
Children are safe, children cannot be blamed, children don't steal, they are not corrupt, and etc. And so it's safe, it has high appeal. And in this case, this was branded as the children of this place and helping them.
Yeah, and in support of your sixth point, I don't mean to interrupt you, in support of that point, for 2 years we were barking up the wrong tree because we had framed it as an issue of human rights for the people of La Arroya and got nowhere. When we framed it as this is the plight of children, it's a crisis of children's health in La Arroya, suddenly media, short-term mission folks, everybody was very focused in.
And so I guess what I'm saying is that maybe we need to learn from that and to say, okay, how are we doing short-term missions when we go out, and how can we, redesign them to have a strong cause, clear goals, achievability, etc., so that people are galvanized and in a sense they go with a passion that sometimes our short-term missions lack. We're going to paint a school, and there's no cause there, if you know what I mean.
This group knows a lot more about short-term mission than I do, and so you all can correct me if I'm wrong. But I just have this hunch that there's a lot of short-term mission groups that would love to do something more meaningful than paint a school. I'm convinced that people are dying to do something that really has an impact on someone's life. A new coat of paint on a school is a nice thing, but I would argue that it doesn't make the kind of difference that people would like to be a part of. We thought in terms of, we had a group of colleagues from Mexico who came and visited us in Peru, the Joining Hands group. And they said to us, well, this is an extreme case. I'm trying to address the question you asked about the applicability, which I think you're raising in all of these questions. They said, consider our situation with the free trade agreement with our country, that the elite of our country, said Mexican Christians, has signed with the elite of your country, they said to me. What are ways that we can get across to, if there are 2 million people involved in short-term mission in a given year, traveling across international borders, if there are that many, what if they began to direct their spiritual, political, and social power towards helping us to make that treaty a bit more equal, or more equitable for Mexican corn farmers, for example, who represent about a fifth of the Mexican population. It's hundreds of millions, tens of millions of people. What are ways that we can begin to shine some light onto these areas, which seem to be passed over in our race to paint more schools and build more clinics and a variety of things that are good, but are we missing some of the best things that we can do in helping to work long-term with partners, doing some analysis, doing some work, and getting into that back and forth, that exchange that will allow us to develop a mission that's both more faithful and effective. It is difficult, and I do see some exceptionalness to this case. It screams, and it gets 100% of the Protestant and Catholic folks who would not be moved by many justice causes. They're on to this one, so that's a factor in this.
One thing that strikes me is a lot of short-term mission trips. It seems like young people, nothing in the trip causes young people to reconsider vocational decisions, college majors, etc. For a lot of trips. And what I'm fascinated with in your case is that you've actually got people in that experience saying, wow, when we see this part of the world, the social, the issues, the problems that we confront, we can actually translate that into a vision for a college major, for a career choice, etc. Was there any intentionality in encouraging young people to consider careers, or was that simply a byproduct of seeing such people with specializations make such a difference in the world?
I think it was the latter. We didn't encourage it to part of the Joining Hands Network. That wasn't part of our agenda. I did notice, and you all would know better, I sensed many times there was a part of the agenda of some of the adults accompanying youth was that an option for seminary or an option for some vocation where they identified it as because of their Christian faith, that was more palatable or more preferable. Other comments, questions? I think I've got a couple more minutes. Oh, great. Other comments or questions?
How do you think the churches and these groups that are committed to going 32 years and that they need each month would feel if they said, the people there said, well, it's good that you did, but we don't need you to come back anymore. Or, like, is there an end of the project where you might not need to go back anymore?
I don't think so, because my sense, the texture of this is it's a human relationship of some depth. And therefore, if we resolve that, we may be looking at an issue of poverty or discrimination in St. Louis next. Or we may be looking at the free trade issue in Peru. Or we may be looking at human rights in Peru or in the States. And so I think there's this openness to consider, again, kind of a globalized view of mission. It's there, it's here, it's everywhere. So how do we become part of what God's doing in both of our places? And so I think that human bond is strong enough that they're now ready to step to the next, whatever the next. They haven't finished this. There's a lot that needs to be done still. I don't want to underplay that. But there's a sense of, well, if we do accomplish what we set out to accomplish in this, then we'll wait on orders from God to take the next step. What will that be? We'll find that out through discernment together.
I'm curious, you mentioned all these NGOs that sort of formed around this. Were some of those related to actually treating the children or medically? Were any of those kind of alongside to look at other aspects, education for these children? And I'm also curious about whether you've had follow-up studies about blood levels.
Thanks. Great questions, Amy. The IHESA, which is the National Health Bureau or Health Office in Peru, is doing a study right now. And so that's the next follow-up. This was done in September 2005, and this is every 4 years they're going to be doing these studies. The NGOs that participated would be like Oxfam America participated, Earth Justice of San Francisco, a number of different organizations, either environmental or human rights development kinds of institutions. Some work has been done with education. No work has been done with treatment. One of the difficulties in a heavily leaded environment is that if you don't take the kid out, it's pointless. You can give them chelation therapy, you can run their blood through, and you can filter out the lead, but then the next time they're exposed to lead, they get it worse because their body doesn't defend as well. And so it's worse for the child if you give them chelation therapy. So no kids in La Jolla are getting chelation therapy right now because you've got to clean up the atmosphere, which is why I think our standard protocols in public health departments in the States is find the source, contain the source, get the kid away from the source immediately, and then you look at treatment and other issues. But we're not to that stage yet. We're not going.
It sounds like it was a dangerous place for people to go. How did the teams overcome that? Was the need just so great to grab their heart there was something?
It did. There was some danger. There was also some unknownness because no one has any data on what this lead exposure does to you 10 years down the line. No one's done those studies. We just have them from 2005. So there's that issue. There was a security issue in a number of situations, particularly when the teams came from St. Louis University and the CDC. And we had about an hour and a half Skype conversation with the session of the church where a lot of the international monitors were coming because they wanted to know, liability issues and who's signing off on this and those very legitimate questions. It became impossible to translate. We finally said, this is all we can say, this is all we know. The rest is in God's hands. And so then people had to sign a waiver for their church and decide if they were going to come or not. But both security and health issues were major issues for folks.
Can you say something about the trips that went from Peru to the United States? Who were on those trips? How did they get funded? What did they do in the United States?
Thank you. Part of the trips from Peru to the United States were smaller groups. They would take, there would be 3 and 4 people. And the folks themselves saw themselves not as going to do mission in the sense of building something, but they saw themselves there as they were going to be witnesses, to share about a reality and what their faith told them about that reality. And so they had a very clear, there was a lot of clarity of vision for those folks. And they stepped into that. They came and they would usually arrive in St. Louis and move on to Ohio. There's a number of churches kind of in that belt. And so they would hit most of the churches in that way. Sometimes other churches would send folks to attend those meetings so they could hear those stories and share them back with them.
Citizens, mothers, children, specialists, doctors? everything?
A little of everything, yeah, because both general population, mothers, teachers, children, and also people who worked in 2 local NGOs that we worked with, the Catholic Church, the Catholic Archbishop. His picture was up here, but I didn't mention him. When we passed Pedro Barreto, a Jesuit father, is the Archbishop of the area that includes La Arroya. And there was this poignant moment when Esteban Nostroza, leader of the Evangelical Church of Peru, Peruvians in Peru, Catholic and Protestant relations are like interfaith relations in this country. And so you can't take for granted that there'll be conversation when Catholics and Protestants are together. She challenged the Archbishop and said, you're a member of the company of Jesus. If Jesus were here, he would walk with us, will you? And he didn't blink an eye and said, yes, the church will walk with you. And they were great legitimacy support to us. He traveled to St. Louis. He came to thank the St. Louis University School of Public Health. I skated right over it, and I didn't even say that to slow down. There was a leaflet that was passed out by the company during the week that the testing was being done. It said, people of Arroyo, beware of the vampires from Missouri who come to suck your blood. Don't give your blood, they're going to sell your blood for high prices in dollars. And this kind of constant conflict between the company and these church groups was a mainstay of that dialogue. And the helpful thing was when you had the legitimacy of people like the Archbishop, all of a sudden these major institutions, both in Peru and the United States, were coming on board. That was a real strength for that.